Well, it looks like we have quite a few participants, so we are going to go ahead and get started because it is right at 2 o'clock. I want to thank you and welcome you to another mission webinar. And we are very glad to have Mrs. Angie Khan with us today. But before we let Mrs. Khan speak, we are going to tell you a little bit of mission. Some of you may know, some of you all may not. But we are leading a statewide effort to promote positive futures for all the adolescents in West Virginia. We work along families as they navigate West Virginia's foster care system, and we provide evidence-based life skills to help teens envision and create positive futures for themselves. And as a result of our work and other agencies putting kids first, in collaboration with all of our partners, school districts, private care, foster agencies, other nonprofits, some of you out there we have probably partnered with. The future is definitely looking brighter for West Virginia's youth, and we should all be very proud of that. We have 2 different programs in our corporation, and Frameworks provides a support for those in or kinship care. We help them understand the system. We help them find a placement agency to prepare to make a huge difference in the life of a child. And if you're interested in fostering, there is the phone number, 866-CALL-MWV or 304-512-0555. And if you're just interested and you want to get a package of information, you can request one at www.missionwv.org/request-information, and someone will definitely help you with that. The program we represent today is called Think, and it's teaching health instead of nagging kids. We empower teenagers to make positive life choices through the education, the life skills, and the coaching that we present. Our program is all evidence-based, and we help them navigate the social and emotional pressures that they face as they develop. It includes building healthy relationships and making healthy choices around drugs, alcohol, and pregnancy prevention. We take a holistic view of all the different aspects so they can make the choices that work best for their lives. We deliver our program in partnership with schools in over 20 counties. We are vetted by all district leaders, teachers, and other school leaders. The program's evidence-based curriculum has shown and been proven to have a positive effect on preventing teen pregnancies, sexually transmitted infections, and sexual risk behaviors. Our educators, we continually update information on trauma, sexual health, and high-risk behaviors. And Angie has been a part of that, helping us understand about high-risk behaviors and trauma. Our management team also does on-site observations of our educators to regularly ensure that fidelity is being followed. We, in conjunction with that, administer pre- and post-surveys. We receive teacher feedback. We hold teen focus groups to see if they think the curriculum is working. And we also do site satisfaction surveys. So we try to ensure that you're getting quality programming and consistency across the board. And we realize, you know, the saying, it takes a village to raise a child. We realize it takes the whole community to help teens envision and create positive futures. So that's why we also provide resources and training to parents, families, and individuals. Some of those are talking about youth, about sensitive and hard topics. How do you do it? We do a hidden in plain sight for parents to help them learn about the different techniques for disguising maybe drug abuse. We do a lot of trainings on trauma, sexual assault prevention, body safety and consent, teen dating violence, and pretty much whatever you request, we can try to provide. For today, the CUs are provided for social work by the Mission West Virginia, and right there is our social work provider number. Today's webinar will be worth 1.5 contact hours. In order to receive it, you have to be in attendance during the live broadcast. And then we will verify that through the Zoom attendance log. And then you have to fill out the survey link that was posted in the chat and also posted here. And it must be completed no later than October 9th. And hopefully CEUs will be sent out starting on October 12th, but at minimum a week. And now introduce Miss Angie Khan. A lot of you may have heard her speak before. It's always a pleasure. She is an educator, a leader, an advocate, a yogi, and a thriver. She works as an independent consultant for She Who Dares, which she founded in 2018 to empower survivors to dare to step out and overcome their trauma to become thrivers. Angie knows it's an honor to be present in sacred spaces with other survivors, and we know that a lot when teens share their stories with us. Her vision is to create sacred spaces for survivors of sexual trauma so they can fully thrive. And I will let her go ahead and expand upon any of her other things. She said to keep her bio short. So I'm going to take her at her word and let her go on and present today is how can we support survivors in their journeys. I'm going to hand it over to you, Miss Angie, and thank you so much as always for being a part of our teaching.
Thank you, Rita. Oh, I was just listening to you talk about Mission West Virginia and what you all do there, and I've known you all for a couple of years now, and just been just honored to work with you all in different spaces. And man, like I am just so excited for everyone that lives that you all touch, because as a teenager, I just think like, wow, what if I had a Rita or a Becky or, you know, anyone that I've seen put on the programs that I've went to schools and seen some of the programming that you all do. We've done conferences. And so I'm just super excited for the future of West Virginia youth.
All right. I'm going to mute myself and I will help you, Becky and I, with the chats. And if we don't get to your question, we will hold your questions till the end.
Yeah. So I am Angie Khan, and I did tell Rita to keep it brief. It's always weird to hear somebody talk about you while you're sitting there listening. I am a survivor of trauma. I am a native to West Virginia, born and raised here. And you know, somewhere along the way, my journey just kind of went sideways. And I think that it's important to know it didn't stay there. And I think that's what survivors need to understand is, you know, if they are still living, breathing, they have survived 100% of their worst days. I think sometimes we lose sight of that, and many times we see those that we're working with, and I saw all of you all, like amazing humans that introduced yourselves from so many agencies, some of them that I know that I work with, and some of them that I've never, you know, I don't know anything about, but there's a lot of helpers on this call today. And so just super excited that you all want to lean in and learn how to support survivors of trauma. But we've all survived something. And I think that's one of the things that we have to remember, is that, you know, we're all human beings and we all come through, you know, hard things. Just some of us have, you know, multiple layers of difficult things. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides with you all. Let's see. And so as you think about supporting survivors of trauma, what brought you here today? Some of you, it may be CEUs, and that's okay. But for others, as you think about what brought you here today and your motivation behind supporting survivors, is it someone in your life? Is it a loved one that you're trying to support? Is it someone, you know, because of your profession? Maybe you're a therapist or a social worker or a teacher, or someone that works with populations that have higher trauma, foster care. So as you're thinking about that, how do you currently support survivors? So I just want to take just a minute to pause here and ask, like, how do you currently support survivors? What does that look like for you personally? And what does that look like in the organization if you work with an organization? And you can pop your answers into the chat, or just write those down. And then the other side of that is, how would you like to support survivors? What would it, if it was an ideal situation, if it was ideal circumstances and you had unlimited resources, how would you like to support them? Because I think it's really important in order to move forward in our practices and to continue to learn about best practices and more efficient practices in the support of post-traumatic growth. We have to understand, how are we currently doing that? And I'm going to ask some more questions in a minute for you all to kind of think about. But what are your current policies on that? What are your capabilities versus what are your limitations? Because some people, when you work for an organization or an agency, we do have limitations on what we are allowed to do within the scope of our organization. I recently trained some social workers in California. I'm working on a contract with the state of California where I am the support. So I support all of the social workers that are working with sexually exploited youth that have decided to do the Cool Aunt series, which is a prevention curriculum for sexual exploitation. And one of the things that we talked about was some of the things that they're faced with is wanting to do something to prevent or to respond in that situation, but their hands are tied. And so sometimes we have limitations in the work that we do. But the first thing we have to understand with every human being is each one of us are icebergs. We really are. And especially the clients that you're working with. Now, it could be a client that you're working with, or it could be a loved one. You could have a child or someone in your family that has experienced various forms of trauma. And so understanding that what we see on the surface about that person is only the surface, that there is so much more underneath of there. And so many times what we see when we're working with survivors is we see the results or the consequences of the trauma that are coming out through their actions and their behaviors. For example, in my own life, when I started to act out at 14 after sexual assault that I experienced, I began skipping school. I began running away. I began shoplifting. And so what people saw was that top of the iceberg. Because I told no one what happened to me. I was so ashamed. I was so embarrassed. I was so humiliated that I couldn't tell anyone about the trauma that I experienced. And so I felt like I had to hold it all in. I felt like it was my fault. I felt like somehow I caused this situation or this trauma to happen to me. And so what people saw wasn't what happened to me. They didn't have an understanding of the trauma that I experienced. What they saw was my behavior as a result of the trauma. And so then I began to be labeled as a delinquent. I began to be labeled as incorrigible. I began to be labeled as a troublemaker or criminal. And so I think this rings true across the board when working with a lot of the populations that we work with. Is we do see the symptoms or the consequences or the results. I do an activity with youth a lot, and with adults that I work with, because I work with adults as well. We do an iceberg activity where where it's an iceberg just like this, and at the top of the iceberg, this is what you know about me from the surface. So these are things that you see about me. So for mine, I put, that I'm high energy, that I smile a lot, that chips and salsa are my love language, adventure is my middle name. And these are things that people already know about me, or kind of can tell once they spend time with me. But then under the surface, what are those things that you don't know about me? And so we really work on just identifying that, because many times we expect the trauma survivor to have an understanding of the trauma that they experienced, which is unrealistic. We're expecting a certain behavior from them. We're expecting a certain action from them, when many times they don't understand what happened to them. They're living in the state of shock, or the state of just feeling like it was their fault. They're buried underneath shame, and so many times you don't see what's underneath, and maybe they don't even recognize what's underneath the surface, because especially if it's a child, they're just responding, they're just acting out. And we have a tendency sometimes to take that personal. And I want to say that too. And I might step on some people's toes, and I might, tick some people off, because I tend to do that. But we've got to ask ourselves, what is our motive behind working with people that have experienced trauma? Is our motive self-centered? Like, have we experienced something that we're trying to feel better by helping someone else? And not that is wrong. It's not wrong that we've experienced something that we don't want anybody else to experience. So we start to throw ourselves into volunteering somewhere or working somewhere because we know what it's like. That's not wrong. But when we begin to try to get our own value or our worth from that, then that's when the lines kind of get blurry. And so thinking about, what is my motive here? Because many times people take the journey that they're walking on with someone, they take it personal if that person doesn't react the way that they want them to. If that child or that youth or that adult isn't responding to all the help that we're giving them, we tend to take that personal. And that is one thing that will shut somebody down, a survivor down, more than anything, is when we see that, because many times, especially if somebody's experienced childhood trauma or a sexual trauma, or it's been a transactional, relationships have been transactional. If you do this, then you get this, or I will give you love if you do this for me. And so everything is kind of transactional, and we've got to be very careful in our response and how we walk alongside the journey with them, that we don't continue that pattern for them. And I understand that I'm a goal-oriented person, and I understand that, yes, there are rewards for things. That's very different than things being transactional, if that makes sense. But helping people to understand, why they might behave the way that they behave. So this iceberg lesson and activity is really good to begin to start to unravel some of those things, unpack some of those things, to help someone to see. Some other questions for reflection. What is the mission of your agency or organization? So getting very clear on what is it that you do, either as an individual. If you are like me, I'm a consultant and I have my own LLC, and I'm starting to do some yoga therapy with people. So that's my mission, and that is to sit with people in space and create an atmosphere that they're invited in to begin to engage in their body. So that's the mission of what I do. The mission of my consulting is to help educate and help other people maybe understand different topics like sexual exploitation and trauma and post-traumatic growth and self-care and all of those things that I personally talk about. So getting very clear on what's the mission of your agency or organization, and then who are you under? Are you private, nonprofits? Are you under, do you work for like CPS or a different agency where it's like government funded and ran, or other? So some of these things will help us to understand like what is our capacity and what is our limitations. And then what is your hierarchy or chain of command within your agency? So if something happens, what is the next steps for you to help you problem solve? And then what is your personal role that you hold? So understanding like, this is my role, this is what I do, this is my limitation, this is my capacity, this is what I can offer people. And then, is your agency trauma informed or trauma specific? Meaning, do you offer specific services like therapy for people that have experienced trauma, or are you an agency that works with different populations that have experienced trauma, but you don't directly treat that specific trauma? And then are you agency centered or are you client centered? And then what is your responsibility and your commitment to your own self-care as you're working with others and helping to support others? And then the last one is, what protocol does your workplace have for supporting employees? So there's a lot here to unpack. There's a lot I want to share with you today, and we have a limited time. And so we're going to have time for questions at the end, but definitely as we're talking, if something pops up, you can put it in the chat or the question and answers box. I'm not going to get to everything that I want to cover, but I'm going to hope to get to some of the main points. My reason for these questions is to help you get very clear on how can you support survivors. Because if we're not clear about a lot of these questions, then the water is kind of muddy and we kind of don't know our parameter, and we can cause more harm to someone than we can help if we're not really clear on our capacity or our limitations or some of these questions. And we don't want to cause more harm. There's many times that we unintentionally cause harm because it's just unintentional. And there's many times that, because of lack of training or lack of understanding, we can intentionally cause harm to someone. So understanding trauma-informed care, trauma-informed organizations, programs, and services are based on an understanding of the vulnerabilities or triggers of trauma survivors that traditional service approaches may exacerbate. So you have to be very careful when working with survivors that what works for one person might not work for another, and what works for people that haven't experienced certain types of trauma won't work for those that have. And so understanding that the services and programs can be more supportive and avoid the re-traumatization. And that's what our goal is. We don't want to re-traumatize people. We don't want to continue to keep people in these cycles of trauma. And then trauma-specific services are intended to reduce trauma symptoms. So that's like EMDR, that's yoga, and maybe somatic services. And so those are very specific. So there's a quote at the top of this that says, with abuse, you suffer the loss of a soul, loss of self, and loss of meaning. In the system, you must fight every day, every minute to keep from feeling worthless and to keep your spirit alive. And I read that quote, and it resonates so much, because not only have people suffered from trauma, they've also suffered being re-traumatized by different systems that are supposed to be set up to help people, but they're only continuing to, because of not being trained or not trying to understand how trauma affects someone, they continue to kind of keep people oppressed and traumatized. And so these were just a couple of quotes taken from survivors that have experienced trauma. Many times, you know, I've been called non-compliant as a teenager, or they might use the term treatment resistant, meaning they think somebody is purposely being defiant, and sometimes they might be, but other times it might be a result of their trauma or echoes of their trauma, and that person doesn't have an understanding of how do they do emotion regulation, how do they you know, step into the space where they can see themselves as being empowered and have control over the visceral reactions that are coming up in their body. If they don't understand these parts, they don't understand, you know, how to not be triggered and to react in such a strong way. And so one trauma survivor says, I got traumatized because of trusting people. So asking me to make a contract with you demands that I trust you, which I can't. And sometimes our services, depending on the service, you know, can be triggering. Making people sign contracts, making people go to, if it's a faith-based organization that's helping, many times, because I work with a lot of my clients that you know are survivors of sexual exploitation, and so they go into safe houses that are faith-based, and they're required to go to church or they're required to go to Bible study, and that's re-traumatizing to them, because it's almost like this: if you do not do this, then you can't stay here, you can't, you know, be protected. And so understanding, is there something within, you know, our organization that could possibly be causing more harm. And so when you demand somebody to do something, or you require someone to do something, kind of thinking about that. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have boundaries if we have programming. We absolutely, you know, children need boundaries, youth need boundaries, even adults, we need boundaries. But there's a way that we can go about that, which I'm going to talk about later, that can produce so much more positive movement in the direction of growth, than that regression that we sometimes see because of the way it's being presented to the person. So understanding trauma helps us to, and many of you have probably had to take trauma training, or if you're a trauma informed organization. So some of what I'm going over may be repeat to you, but it's always good. I know for me, I learn by repetition. So sometimes it's good to hear it. We might hear it in a different way. But understanding that there are continuums of trauma. Trauma isn't just a lump, one size fits all, that this is what it looks like. So, you know, we have acute trauma, which are isolated incidents. So an isolated incident might be that the person has experienced a house fire, or maybe they've been a victim of a flooding, so a natural disaster. It might be that they've been the victim of a crime. Maybe they went on vacation and they're walking down the street and they get mugged. It could be that, you know, whatever, it's a one-time event that happened. It could be a medical trauma in that person's life, where that person went in for surgery and something went wrong, and so that's a trauma. Then you have chronic trauma, which is a repeated or a prolonged trauma. So someone that's experienced domestic violence, someone that's experienced childhood sexual abuse, someone that's experienced war, Maybe they went off to war and come back. So it's this repeated or prolonged type of trauma. And then you have complex trauma, which is a multi-layered poly-victimization. It could be that the person is abused as a child and then again abused as an adolescent by someone else. They have multiple people that are abusing them. And this happens over a very long period of time. So it's all these combinations of trauma when you're talking about complex trauma. And understanding that each of these traumas deserve healing. Each of these traumas deserve a space where someone can go and get help for what they're experiencing after the trauma. But each of these traumas need a very different type of healing. You would not treat someone that's experienced, lived through a house fire or a mugging the same way that you would treat someone that's experienced sexual exploitation, or someone that's experienced, domestic violence over a period of, let's say, 5 years. The same way that you would treat, someone that went off to war and went on 3 tours. And so we have to get very clear on, the types of recovery that we can offer people and the types of support that people need, depending on the type of trauma that they've experienced. Many of you have probably heard about the ACE, adverse childhood experiences, but what we're learning is how that affects people. I always say I had an ACE score of 8.5. My parents were never divorced, but they very much lived very separate lives. And so our ACE scores can help us determine and help, especially those of you that work with younger children. That's a great way to kind of help you help them build resiliency. If you know that they're experiencing they're experiencing the divorce in their family, or there's some substance abuse going on, you can then begin to create some resilience building activities for that younger child before it gets to the point where they're starting to escalate because of the circumstances that they're living in, because of their experiences. And on the other side of that, looking at, adverse community environments and how that leads to trauma. We know that ACE having a high ACE score is very traumatizing, and we know that it has long-term effects on people. But there's also this adverse community environment where there's constant poverty. They live in an area that is just very impoverished, and we have generational poverty, which families for years have been caught in this cycle of poverty or discrimination, or poor housing or quality of housing. There's violence in their community. And so understanding that these two things really has an effect, especially on children and youth and adults, and how they show up in the world. And we know that the relationship between early childhood trauma and health and well-being is greatly affected later in life. We've seen it. Studies have shown, high blood pressure and diabetes and all of these things that are physical because of the trauma that someone's experienced. Chronic fatigue. I work with so many survivors that have long-term physical problems because of the trauma that they've went through, whether that's an autoimmune disease, whether that's chronic pain. There's so many things that they live with because of the trauma that they've experienced. And so as we understand that, it helps us to have an understanding so that we can then be able to make plans of action to be able to best support that person. or persons if we're working with multiple. So it's important for us to understand trauma. It's important for us to know the population that we're working with, and identify the population that we're working with, whether that's youth, whether that's children, whether that's adults, or combination. It's important for us to know our capacity and our limitations, both personally and professionally. And then weigh in the cost of that each day, every day, doing a self check-in, because we are not superhumans. We can only do so much, and many times we fail people because we're trying to do it all. We're trying to be everything to all people, and that is ultimately going to cause harm, not only to ourselves but to others. So understanding, like, we've got to do a self check-in and begin to take care of ourselves so that we can better care for the people that are depending on the services that we're providing. That's a really good way to support survivors of trauma. So if we're talking about understanding trauma in order to support survivors better, many times we have these expectations of the clients that we're serving that are unrealistic, or they're us-centered because we don't really understand the nature of the trauma. And so Dan Siegel has this amazing hand model of the brain that I use to help children and adolescents understand trauma. But if you would just, like, if you hold your hand up, kind of the bottom part of your hand and your wrist will represent like the downstairs part of your brain. This is the part of your brain that really just does basic functions. So your heartbeat, your breath, the things that you don't have to think about. And then if you take your thumb and put it across your hand, this is the middle part of your brain that houses like the hippocampus and the amygdala, which is the connector part of the brain. This is the part of the brain that's the communication part that communicates the bottom part with the top part. And the top part of our brain is our prefrontal cortex. This is the part of our brain that can think straight, that can look at a problem and assess it, that where our feelings are. This is the part of our brain that is the right, the left part that has all the beautiful parts that make us who we are. And so if you fold those top fingers over top of that thumb, this is what a brain should do. The bottom part should be connected to the top part through that middle part of the brain. And many times when people have experienced trauma, the top part comes up, we call it flipping our lid. And now they're disconnected, so they're not communicating. There's no communication going on. We are in fight, flight, freeze, fawn mode. We're just reacting out of survival. And this is where a lot of times survivors live. They live in this constant survival, even if they've been able to exit the situation, until they're able to learn about what happened to them and new empowering ways of being. Many times certain things can trigger someone, and when someone is triggered, that top part, we flip our lid, that top part disconnects, and now there's no communication going on. And so we wonder why is that kid acting like that, or why is that adult acting like that? Well, it's because there's no communication going on. The brain isn't functioning the way it needs to. The upstairs part of the brain that has all of the ways to reason and to think isn't connected to the downstairs part of the brain. So just the downstairs part of the brain is functioning, which is that part that just survives. And so it's important for us to know that, because when we know that, we're not asking any longer, why is that person acting like that? Or why did they say that? Or I don't understand why they just don't get it. And it's because it's not connected at that point, because something has triggered them. So again, understanding the types of trauma help us to understand the person that we're working with too. Is there an abuse trauma? Is there relational trauma? Is it sexual trauma, childhood trauma, medical disaster? Is it intergenerational trauma? Or is it vicarious trauma? Many people in the helping profession that are like all of you, sometimes we experience that vicarious trauma where we're seeing these things and we're hearing these things that are happening to the people that we're serving and working with, and it's traumatizing us as well. And then we have collective trauma as well, which is what we lived through in the pandemic, and it's what we lived through in 9/11. It's these collective things that happen to us as a community. And so understanding how trauma affects our brain and then how trauma affects our body as a result of the reaction in our brain can help us to also understand our client better as well. Understanding that it causes all of these things to happen, the disassociation, the panic attacks, the disordered eating, self-blame, self-harm, insomnia, constant feeling on edge, substance abuse issues, which then leads to that fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And so you have, the way it comes out in children, you have if a child is in that fight mode and they're yelling and they're screaming and they're not able to hear you because they're just so angry. They're hitting, kicking, biting. They might be blaming others constantly, very defensive, demanding or controlling. They might be oppositional or defiant, non-compliant. There's that word again. Moving towards they move towards what feels threatening because they're gonna fight it. Whereas if you have a child that is in that flight mode, they want to run away. They're unfocused. They're mentally already gone. They're mentally already took off in their mind. They're preoccupied, or they make themselves busy with something else to avoid the threat that is around them. They might move away from what feels threatening. So they might run and hide underneath the bed or in the closet. They might be panicked or worried or scared a lot. And then if you have a kid that is functioning, or a youth that's functioning in freeze, it's that shutting down. The mind just goes blank. They want to hide. It's not even that they want to run away. They just don't want to be seen. They want to curl up in a tiny ball and hide. They're verbally unresponsive. So they might try to ask them a question. But if they're triggered and they're in that visceral response, they're gonna blank. They might tell you, I don't know, because they cannot access those parts of their brain that they need to access in that space. They have difficulty completing tasks. They might daydream. They feel stuck. And it's the same with adults as well. And then they have added like the fawn response, which is the people pleaser, no boundaries, overwhelmed, codependency. But if you look at this in adults, on the left-hand side, for flight, somebody that is in flight mode, they might be a workaholic or an overthinker. They have a difficulty sitting still. Maybe they're a perfectionist. Again, in the fight mode, just those angry outbursts that need to control. They might be the bully. You might see this in children that are bullying other children. I always feel like if you have a child that's bullying another child, there's something going on there deeper. That child has some kind of trauma, something unstable in their lives. And then the freeze mode is difficulty making decisions. You feel stuck, disassociated, isolating. So we look at someone through a lens of trauma. This first part isn't the lens of trauma. So if you're working with a child or an adult, and you're not trauma informed, what would you say about that person? For myself, many times people would say, why can't you just behave? Why can't you just be good? Why can't you just get it? Why can't you just do better? or what's wrong with you? Why are you always doing that? Why are you always saying that or acting like that? It's just this constant, you victim blame the person. And the person, 9 times out of 10, if they haven't had help, they don't know. They don't know why they're responding in the way that they're responding, if they're not getting therapy or having some kind of help or services. And so thinking about the clients that you serve, when you look at them through a non-trauma informed lens, and you might have before, and this isn't to heap guilt on people, we need to be aware. That's why you're all here. And so what does the non-trauma informed style say about the person versus looking through the trauma lens? So looking at that person or that individual and saying, okay, this is what I know about trauma. And I know this person has been traumatized. So this is what I know about trauma. And then many times, if we're talking about an adult, that maybe they're dealing with substance abuse, or maybe they're just trying to numb pain. We know because trauma survivors often started using substances to prevent feeling greater pain. Sorry about my spelling. To feel something, or because it was forced on them. I think a lot of times people don't understand, those that are addicted to substances. I've worked with many addicts that have been sexually exploited, that was forced maybe at an early age, was given pain pills, or was given a substance and gotten addicted to it or hooked on it because they were forced to take it. When I was being sexually exploited and trafficked, my trafficker used substances against me. They used substances to control me. And then after a prolonged period, I became addicted because they kept giving it to me. They kept forcing it on me. And so my body became addicted to it. It wasn't because I wanted it. It wasn't because I wanted to be on drugs. It was because it was being used against me. And then I was addicted. So understanding it through that lens is super important. And when we're serving survivors, you take the trauma into account. You consider the trauma. You try to avoid reactions from yourself, like things that you might do or say that could accelerate that, because they're already feeling vulnerable. If they're getting services from you, they're already feeling vulnerable. They're already dealing with all of the things that come with that experience that they've had. So shame, guilt, anger, sadness, the unable to regulate emotions. And many times our reaction to maybe something that they're sharing with us can really accelerate those reactions back to us. And we don't mean to. It's just that natural. So maybe even getting trained on, how do we respond when somebody says a really hard thing to us, or somebody says something that feels like unbelievable. Then we adjust the behavior, either whether it's a counselor or a staff person, whoever you are in your organization, adjusting that behavior to support the individual's coping capacity. So understanding that if that person doesn't have a lot of self-awareness that you're working with, they're not going to have a lot of great coping strategies. So they're going to do things that you might be scratching your head wondering, why did they do that? And it's as they begin to learn, as you continue to support, and they begin to put some more tools in their toolkit and build their capacity to cope, that then they'll be able to make different decisions. Because if you don't know it, you don't know that you need to make a different decision, you continually will respond the way you always have responded. And then also trauma-informed services allow survivors to manage their trauma symptoms successfully, so that they're able to access, retain, and benefit from their services. Meaning, if we don't teach in an age appropriate way, because we can even teach kids about how trauma affects them, teaching people in an age appropriate way about the experiences that happen to them, taking that stigma away from it, taking that it's your fault, or maybe even them feeling like it's their fault, away from them, like lifting that burden, then helps them to be able to better engage in the services that you're providing for them. It helps them to be able to engage with you and with what you're asking them to do within programming in a way that maybe they haven't been able to before. So you're also offering them on this other side, again, teaching them about trauma, giving them that awareness, emphasizing safety, giving them opportunities to rebuild their own control, because when somebody is traumatized, everything's out of your control. And so you've got more people coming in to try to tell you what to do and to make decisions for you. When there's maybe some decisions they can make, you can give them choices on that and they can make those decisions for themselves. And then using a strength-based approach. I was talking to Rita before this webinar, and we were talking about many times, because when working with youth, many times people only see, and they've said to me, many times people just see me as a problem. They only see all the things, all my bad decisions. They only see, just all of the bad things that I've done. We don't recognize many times people's strengths, especially if they're coming to us for services, because if they're coming for services, then they're going through a hard time, or they're going through a problem, or they're going through something. And so we just see the problem versus seeing their strength. So how do we implement support? Our foundation of that, we have to have education for everybody, for all your staff, including, like, even if we're talking about schools, even the custodians, even those that maybe not have direct one-on-one contact with people, but work in the office. So administrators, everyone needs to be trained. It doesn't just need to be you as the person working or providing the services. It needs to be a holistic, everybody's going to be trained on this that works in this organization if we're going to make an impact. We need to really create policies and procedures around how do we do referrals and how do we do intakes, and what is our termination. Like, what we have to create, for me personally, like, what is grounds for termination? What is grounds that I can't do any more peer mentoring? I always make sure the person has someone else that they can go to, or I'll connect them with somebody else if I can no longer work with them due to, a boundary issue or a safety issue. We recognize vicarious trauma and appropriate care of staff. This is probably the least cared for thing when we work in populations of trauma, is understanding that we've got to provide some wellness programs for our staff. You all as providers need wellness programs created for your mental health days, and things offered, whether it's on video or whether it's in person, to help someone to really be able to process some of the things we hear and see, because it's really heavy. You all know this, it's really heavy. So we have to make sure we're taking care of ourselves and we're not burning out and we're not having high turnover because we haven't provided the opportunity for people to adequately take care of themselves when they're in the field of taking care of others. We have to have knowledge of effective trauma recovery services. Again, it's not a one size fits all. So what works for one person might not work for the other. We can't try to squeeze everybody in this box and think that, okay, we did our protocol, it didn't work, they're non-compliant, or they don't want to go with the program. Because if we understand that maybe they need something different, maybe what's worked for this person's used to become really successful and start to thrive, this person doesn't get it in the same way. So understanding that it isn't a one size fits all when it comes to treating and supporting trauma. And then advocacy within the agency and partner agencies. I think, this has to be a community effort to help survivors thrive. It can't just be just one person, one organization, or one person trying to get all of the credit. Like, we have to be collaborative across community and state and nation. Like, we have to be collaborative if it's going to be successful. If we really have the best interest of the person, we're going to be collaborative with everybody that we need to be collaborative with across our state. And then the other one was, understanding the impact of historical trauma in all forms of oppression. And so understanding there's different layers of trauma. There's different layers of populations that need services and help. And also seeing that, healing isn't linear. We think it should be like, oh, okay, it's been 3 weeks, 2 days, and 50 minutes, then you should be here. Or it's been 6 years, you should be here. There's no, it's not this big, nice, neat, straight line. What it really looks like is this part over here where it's all squiggly and it's all messy. You might have one day as a survivor where, I have days where I'm doing amazing and life just is fitting well, and it just seems to have a rhythm to it. And there might be another day I might wake up after having maybe 6 good months, and I might wake up and I just feel heavy. And there's something that maybe I'm not aware of, but my body is aware of, that viscerally I'm responding to. I woke up one morning and I just felt heavy, and I just laid out all the art supplies, and I didn't know what I was going to make. I didn't have a direction. I just knew I had to get this heaviness out of my body. I had to do something to engage in a way that fostered creativity, because that's a way that I heal. I heal through being creative and making things and painting, even though I'm not great at painting. It's just a way to get it out. Some people thrive, by writing. Some people thrive, they want to cook. That helps them to be able to process maybe something physically going on with them. I don't know. There's as many people as there's as many ways that people are able to express, or to allow to let go of things that are maybe going on or happening. This is one of my favorite quotes. People start to heal the moment they feel heard. And I just kind of want to sit with this for a second, because this is probably the most monumental piece of supporting a survivor of trauma. When we're able to come into this place where we're heard, where we're seen, where we're validated, it changes everything. If you have a child that is acting out, that child does not feel heard. That child does not feel seen in that situation. And so they feel like they have to make themselves bigger. They have to act out more. They have to be more aggressive in order to be acknowledged. And it's that way across the board. So if we can come into a place where our experiences are validated, our experiences are heard, our experiences are seen, there is something internally that shifts. I remember a few years ago, I was in I was doing some trauma recovery, and my therapist she put her hands on my face, and we were in an intensive. So this was allowed. This wasn't a crossing of boundaries. I was in an intensive program. And she said, Angie, I see you. And something broke in me and shifted when I was like, that's what I had been fighting for my whole life, was to be seen. And not just seen physically, like seen emotionally, seen as a person, seen just as a human being and my dignity. And something shifts in people when we're able to sit with them and really lean in and see beyond their behavior. But we have to do this in safe context, right? We do have to have safety for ourselves, safety for our clients. So understanding, asking, if you're trying to create a plan with your client, like what does physical safety look like to you? Because it might look different to different people. Who and when are services? So where are the services around that they can reach out to if they need that physical safety? Like who is allowed to come? Who do they want in their space? And so having them understand, what to expect. You do this with youth is what's the visiting plan if they have a visit with their families? What does that look like? Getting very clear about that, because I think sometimes where we go wrong is we're not clear when we help a person create their safety plan or figure out what does that look like to them. If you have a person that's experienced domestic violence, they don't know what physical safety looks like. If you have a person that's experienced sexual exploitation by multiple people and multiple parts of society, they don't know what that physical safety looks like. And so helping them figure that out and navigate that terrain. Asking them, is there anything I can do to help you feel more safe? And then the Vicarious Trauma Prevention Plan is for you as a provider. Like, what do you need to help you feel physically safe? What is it that you need? What are your boundaries for yourself? And then creating emotional safety, clear and consistent boundaries. So as you're able to state and carry out clear and consistent boundaries, you model that to your client. And that's so important for supporting them and for them to begin to understand what normal is, because there is no normal when you've lived through trauma over and over and over again. You don't have that emotional safety. You weren't in an environment where that was conducive or that was modeled. And so as we model it, they're able to see that for what it is. So for instance, for my own kids, for emotional safety for them, there's been many times that I've had to go back to them and ask for forgiveness. I've had to go back to them and say, hey, I really said that harsh. I'm really sorry for that. And no, it doesn't take it back, right? It doesn't make it that I didn't yell at them or say something harsh to them in a moment of anger, but it does create that space for repair to show them this is what a normal relationship looks like. I don't get to just walk all over you and then never acknowledge that I walked all over you. I'm going to come back to you and I'm going to try to make it right in a way that is healthy. And so giving them that space to speak up, or if it's for you as an organization or an individual, creating that space within the organization that you can talk about the vicarious trauma and what are the steps and what are the services that are available for you, creates emotional safety for yourself. Transparency, explaining the why. This is so important. For survivors, is many times things are happening so fast without our control that we didn't understand what was going on. And so on this side of it, when I've had people and when I've also sat down with somebody and been transparent with them and just explained, like, this is why we have to do this. And this is, I'm just honest with them about it. there is so much more trust that's created in that relationship. The predictability part is important too when you're supporting survivors, because when somebody's going through trauma over and over, there's no predictability. Everything, it could be fine one minute, and the next minute everything's hit the fan and everything's unstable, and there's yelling or there's hitting or there's things happening that there was no predictability. You had no clue that something was about to happen. So creating that predictability and being, as you're being honest and transparent and saying, okay, this is, and just being honest and saying this is what we're planning. Now, these could be the possible barriers. These could be some obstacles that might come up too. So that way, if something does come up, it's not that you were being dishonest with them. It's that you didn't kind of foresee this happening. So you're being very transparent, honest, and predictable. You're laying it out there. And then choice, true choice, not just you're gonna talk about choice. You're gonna start to allow them some space to have some choices in what's happening. And then as far as restoring power, just that empowerment model, being able to allow them, and I have another slide that kind of goes through that. Part of empowerment is helping them understand what's happened to them. But the other part of that is modeling that modeling the behaviors and, the language and the tone. And all of that is so important. How we talk to people is important, the tone that we use. And then giving them choice as much as possible. So I understand that there's limitations in certain places, but maybe if you're able to give them 2 or 3 options of potentials, okay, we're going to do this. You can choose this, or this. Is there one that you like better? Or is there one that you would like to try? The strength perspective, focusing on their strengths. What are they good at? There's tons of strength assessments out there that you can get for free if you're working with youth or older. And I think there's even kid ones. Helping them to see, because I think sometimes survivors kind of stay stuck in spaces because they only see themselves as bad, or they only see themselves as their trauma, or they only see themselves as others have labeled them. And so allowing them that space to see what are their strengths? What are they really good at? And helping them build on their strengths versus staying stuck in the things that are causing them harm is super important. And it also helps them focus on the future. It helps them then see hey, I have future ahead of me. Because if they're always stuck in that past space because people are always telling them what's wrong with them, or, oh, you'll never change, you're always going to be like that, or whatever the narratives are that people are saying to them, they're never able to see past where they're at. They're never able to dream past the space that they're in. So it's so important that we help them to see and recognize and point out what are their strengths, help them to discover those. So then they can begin to see maybe I can dream to be this in the future, or go to school, or get a certification, or do something beyond today. And then helping them build those skills in each encounter that they go to. So if they're trying to get a job, and they don't get the job, that's a big disappointment. And to a person that has experienced trauma, it could be devastating. It can maybe cause this reaction that I knew I wasn't any good. I knew people didn't like me, all of these things, right? This worst case scenario type of things. But if we help teach them, how do they deal with that disappointment in a way that they can still honor themselves, hey, you went out and you tried, that's amazing. Maybe that just wasn't the right job. Maybe we can try again tomorrow. Is there another place that you would like to try? So using every disappointment or every kind of setback as an opportunity to build resilience and strength. I just kind of talked about some of those. Some other ways to support, again, some of these I've talked about. Believe them, listen to them, not only support with your words, but support with your actions. Respect their privacy. Respect the right to have a privacy to whatever degree that they need that privacy. Recognize the boundaries. Give yourself boundaries. I know for me, when I first started supporting survivors and helping survivors, I would let them call me all hours of the night. I never took the weekends off, and I was exhausted. And I began to implement, okay, if it's after 5 p.m., here's a different phone number that you can call. Here's the crisis support line. I began to help them branch out and recognize and identify other supports other than me, because you can't be everything to everyone all the time. And so identifying those boundaries, advocate and help survivors learn how to advocate for themselves. So it's one thing to advocate for them in the beginning. It's another thing to help them to start to learn, how do they advocate for themselves? How do they speak up for themselves? Like, how do they begin to do that for themselves? What are some situations they can start to kind of test the waters and begin to do that? Identify barriers as they arise, recognizing that, helping them to identify barriers and then solutions. Support their decisions. All of us make decisions that aren't the best sometimes. All of us make decisions that, hindsight would tell us, oh, we shouldn't have made that decision. But to the best of our ability, that's how we learn. So supporting their decisions, even if it's not something that you would necessarily choose for them. Stay connected or create the atmosphere to help the survivor connect healthily to community. So if they're in a program where they're graduating and you're no longer going to be part of their connection piece or part of their support piece, knowing that, when you're going to not be able to walk with them anymore in this journey, begin to start to help them connect to other spaces, to other people, and start to build that in enough time before they graduate from your program or they're moving on to someone else. Identify that in enough time so that they're already building those connections and they're not just thrown into this new environment. And now they no longer have this person that they've had for 5 years or however many years in their corner anymore because of policy, right? Because we have to graduate them or whatever. And then empower them, help them to become empowered in ways that we can empower them with dignity, choice, and autonomy. Is begin to, in the ways that you can through your programming, help them to understand how trauma impacted their brain, their nervous system, and how to reverse those changes. There are so many beautiful ways through physical movement and different programs, yoga, somatic therapies, that we can begin to kind of reverse some of those things, or keep it from getting worse in our lives. Help them to understand that the quirks and the behavior are not because they're crazy or there's something wrong with them or because they're broken or because they're just abnormal, but it's a result of their circumstances. It's a result of the trauma that they've experienced, that they're not alone in that. There's others that have experienced that. And then helping them understand that the pain, the betrayal, and the shame of the trauma or the abuse that they've experienced. And then how to deal with that in an appropriate manner, instead of internally or externally. And then purpose and meaning, what their purpose and their meaning. So helping them develop personally? Like, what are their passions? What are they really good at? What can they build on? What are their talents? That will propel them into post-traumatic growth. Because ultimately we want them to thrive. Ultimately, we want them to shift from victim to survivor to thriver. And to understand that those experiences that happen to them, though they've had an impact on them, they're not the sum total of who they are as an individual. And then valuing them as an individual, respect their lived experience, and value them as an individual. Collaborations, like making sure again that there's a community that's surrounding them, having compassion towards them, and understanding, having that empathy to understand that this is why they might be acting or reacting like that. And also compassion for yourself and taking care of yourself as a provider. And then your relationship with them is, by modeling, by creating boundaries for them, by showing them healthy versus, maybe what they've known as unhealthy in relationships, helping them learn, and then partnering with them. And so be mindful of our own words or our tendencies to deny their experience or to prioritize them in a way that's unhealthy, or to not help them to recognize their accountability as they're growing, or to dismiss their experiences by going, well, regardless, your kids are doing great, even if you're not feeling great, right? We sometimes dismiss people by telling them to look on the bright side, or it could be worse, or even kind of threatening them in a sense, like, well, you want to stay in that relationship? So do you want your kid to be worse than you were? And that's been said to people. Like, these are things that people that I've worked with that's been actually said to them by providers. Or telling them that, well, it was your choice. As a kid, I was told, well, it was your choice to run away. So what happened to you, it's your fault because it was your choice. So not being very careful when we have that tendency to go into those old mindsets of looking at people on the top of the iceberg versus the underneath part of the iceberg. And then it's okay to talk it through with them. Just talking to them and if they're upset about a way that they reacted, maybe they yelled at their kid or they reacted in a way that they were trying to not react. Maybe they took a drink or, did some or harmed. And just helping them to understand, like saying things like, in times of stress, it's difficult for our brains to retain information. So having them repeat back to you when you're working with them, maybe some things that you're saying or some things that could help them or some things that they're learning. So giving them those tools so that they can be empowered, so they're not depending on you. Telling them things like, is there a way to make this more comfortable, or is there a way to make this feel more safe for you, or how would this look? How would this feel more successful? What can we do to help make this feel more successful for you? So just the way that we word things, but it's okay to kind of talk it through with them and be honest about things with them. And so our last step is, identifying the policies and the practices in your workplace, right, around you, that have the potential to re-traumatize, or within us, right? Because we all have those things in us, where we have judgment and biases and things about us as human beings that could potentially re-traumatize those that are accessing your services. So getting really honest about it. If we're really wanting to support survivors, getting really honest about where we're at as an organization, where we're at as individuals, because we can't change what we don't acknowledge. And so write at least one thing that you can do differently to be more trauma informed. What is one thing that you can do as an organization or as an individual to shift the way that you respond and support those that come for care or for support? So awareness, understanding, creating safety, restoring power, valuing the individual. All of those are part of how we support survivors of trauma. Oh, okay. I know that was a lot, y'all. You all stayed with me. I so appreciate it. I'm going to stop my screen.
We did have one question. It says, how can we help people move towards looking at someone from a trauma-informed lens? I work with teachers in a pre-K through 12 setting, and I struggle to help them understand the importance on viewing their students in a trauma-informed way rather than engaging in victim blaming.
Yeah, especially when you're with kids, I think it's really easy to see the kids' behavior, right? So if you have kids coming to class, preschool, and you're just viewing it, I would say, I mean, are they willing to go to training? Are they willing to be able to, you know, there's a TED Talk on adverse childhood experiences that's really good. I'll send all of that resources to you all, Rita, and you could forward it to everybody that joined today. But giving them resources and tools like the TED Talk or some other things that you're learning, talking about what you've learned and how you're implementing it sometimes can help others have a better understanding as well. But ultimately, they have to be willing to kind of change some things about themselves, which is really hard sometimes for people.
Okay, and we also had requests for copies of your PowerPoints if you're amenable to that, and if you're not, that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll send you all the information.
Okay. We got lots of comments. Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I needed to learn that, clear and easy to digest. So you brought it down to a level that, you know, we could also understand easily, remember, and put into practice. So we appreciate that.
Yeah, I think the most important part is just what kind of grace do we need? Right? Because we need understanding sometimes, and realizing that our clients do too. And I, you know, when I talk about realizing our capacity, realizing when, you know, maybe they're not responding to you. You've tried and you've tried and you've tried. Maybe there's someone else within your agency or your organization you can kind of plug them into to be able to then know when to surrender and know when to go, how can I get them a different kind of help? Maybe they're not responding to you. So knowing our own capacities and limitations.
I think it goes back to what you said in the beginning too, about what is your reasoning for wanting to help, to step into it. And that goes a long way also. If your heart's in the right place, then they will feel that connection.
Yeah, and I've been guilty of it in the beginning too, of trying to, like, I feel so good if somebody's listening to me and they're being successful, and then I feel like, oh, I've ruined the person if they're not, and really it's about not taking it personal. Like, it's not about us. I tell people that facilitate groups and stuff, we don't approach people up here above them. We want to approach people like, hey, I'm on this journey with you and I'm human too. And so as we journey together, kind of having compassion and understanding for one another.
Just coming alongside someone in their difficulties. Good lessons to learn. Any more questions before we let Miss Angie go? As always, it is a pleasure to have you on, and you always bring it, and you bring it, just like I say, in a way that we can process it, remember it, and then put it into action. So we appreciate that. So we appreciate you. We're going to sign off, and I hope you all have a great rest of the days. Do some self-care. Thank you, Angie.
Yes, be kind to yourself. Bye.